Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy. This is a conversation with Linnette Werner and David Hellstrom on intentional emergence teaching and learning, a contemporary and compassionate pedagogy for teaching leadership. And you're with the International Leadership Association. My name is Dan Jenkins, and I'm Chair and Associate Professor of the Leadership and Organizational Studies program at the University of Southern Maine and co-editor of the Pause for Pedagogy series. The ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Linnette and David to our latest conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. So welcome, Linnette and David. How are we doing?
Thank you. Hello.
Thank you. Thanks for having us today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. So can you tell us just a little bit about yourselves?
My name, as Dan said, is Linnette, and I am the director of the undergraduate leadership minor at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also the interim assistant vice provost for student life.
I'm David, and I've been a teaching specialist here for a decade and a half, and lately I've been working on curriculum and instructor support.
Great. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're excited to. And just so our viewers know, we did have a third co-author, but she's unable to join us on the interview today, Krista Storia, who contributed as well to the article in our series. So let's jump right in. So what were some of the key questions you were hoping to address when you were putting this article together?
Well, we have a fairly long history here in our minor. We actually just celebrated our 20th anniversary. And in our first decade, much of our classes were fairly what we would consider the old definition of leadership. They were very transactional. Students were learning lists, 7 ways to manage a conversation or things like that. Or they were very experiential, but more activity-based. Like, we want you to go out and work on cleaning up the river and have that activity and team build. And all of these experiences stood alone as interesting and even enjoyable, but didn't really scaffold to leadership learning. So it brought us to the question that we thought was going to be important, which is, how can we teach leadership in a way that gives students skills that they can use in different contexts? Because we found our alumni were calling us and saying, we love being in your program, but it didn't really translate to the work we have to do in our workforces, in our organizations, in our volunteer work. And so we knew right then we needed to transform to a model that scaffold to real leadership education.
Okay. Linnette, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say that we found that as David said, our alumni were saying, it's so much harder than you made it out to be in the real world. And we're working with 18-year-olds to 23-year-olds. And so it's an emergent time for adulthood. And so we knew that there had to be a lot of scaffolding around whatever we did. But what I think the most important thing we heard was there could be more heat. There could be more of using the classroom as an actual laboratory, so that when we get out into the workforce, there isn't this big gap between kind of these fun experiences and theoretical learning into applied learning.
Great. So let's unpack it a little bit more. So where did the idea or the need for both the intentional emergence, model process approach, as well as, realizing that there was this need to be more intentional on how you would prepare your part-time and full-time faculty to teach in this way?
That's a great question. So when we found out that we really needed to take a look at how we were teaching, it wasn't necessarily what we were teaching, because we still teach the social change model, the 5 practices, and we still use many of the same materials. It was just how we were teaching it that we really wanted to change. And I came across Sharon Parks's book, Leadership Can Be Taught, and it was as if she had written it for us. I got goosebumps when I read it. And David likes to tell the story. I was hugely pregnant with my 3rd child. And I walked into our faculty meeting and I said, who's with me on this? And I held this book, and David said, everybody else looked down and looked away. But he was like, really, you're going to leave the poor pregnant woman standing there asking who's with me? And so he said, I'll read it and I'll try it out with you. And so it was really the work of Ron Heifetz around adaptive leadership, and then Sharon's beautiful narrative of how that works. That was the inspiration. But as if anybody who has read it knows, that's a very specific population that leadership can be taught looks at. And that's executives and graduate students at the Harvard Kennedy School. We're the University of Minnesota, and we're looking at 18 to 23-year-olds typically from very diverse backgrounds who have a set of knowledge that's really disparate across the classroom. You have students who might be running their own businesses. You have students who may have really never even held a student leadership position before. And so to turn the classroom into that living laboratory, we found after working with Sharon for about 10 years on the model, it took a lot more scaffolding. And what I love about Sharon and her thoughts and her talents coming into our conversation was that she's one of the experts in student development and how we foster relationships and develop young people through mentorship. And she was passionate about Ron's work as well. So really what happened was David said, great, I'll read the book, I'll try translating it. And he tried several semesters. And then we found that we needed to have a bigger conversation around what this really was. And so intentional emergence came over the course of 10 years and in working collaboration with Sharon really closely.
We knew that the students were asking this question, how does this apply? And we realized we had been deferring that question, like, well, you'll find out someday, or I'm sure it all comes together. And we knew we had to be able to answer that question. We had to be able to say, well, this is how, and this is where. That was a really vital and valuable question. The second question that we took on for our instructors was, to what end? And so all of the work, and that's where the intentional part of our model really came into play. Everything that we do, to what end? How does this scaffold to a skill set they will use? How does this lead to understanding you have agency and voice? All of these moments can no longer stand alone. And since we wanted to have a model that connected to other things and connected to next classes, we knew that it could not be random, especially in our context, because our institution, right now we have over 35 adjunct instructors teaching courses here. To keep them on the same page for what we want to do, we need to ground that in something that they could hang on to. So we found out early on as we started this model that the instructor was actually too much of a criteria for how the course would go. So students were like, oh, this instructor was wonderful and we loved them and it was a great leadership experience. This instructor, never really captured us. We didn't get engaged. And we got those evaluations, and that led us to the next question. The instructor should not be the variable that matters. The curriculum should be the variable that matters. So how do we create something that this large spectrum of different teachers can ground themselves in something that gives value to the students regardless of who the instructor is?
That's great. That's great. What would you say? Well, first off, how long have you been running these seminars for your part-time faculty? And I know that you've begun to also invite others to take part in the experience, but could you share a little bit about that? And then I've got some follow-up questions about the experience specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really funny because when we started trying out this model, we went to the faculty board. We have a faculty oversight board, and we said, this is really working. We really want to do this. And they were really skeptical. They said, it works for David and it works for Linnette, but it's not going to work for anybody else. And then they also said, you are going to lose your adjuncts. They are going to run, and you're not going to be able to keep your enrollment up. And so maybe it was just because they gave us the challenge. Maybe that's why it actually worked. But we went back to our adjuncts, and it turned out that this was in 2010, that by teaching them the kind of what we had learned and putting the pedagogy around it, so it wasn't random, because many of them felt like case in point was a little too mythical, or they didn't know what the ingredients were. And so by putting more scaffolding around it and answering to what end and bringing in that intentional side, they were able to see it's not magical. It's a very methodical process, but it's an intentional process of getting yourself out of the middle of it all. And so what ended up happening is word got out that it was one of the best places to teach on campus. And we ended up with waiting lists of people who wanted to teach. And I can assure you, it's not because of the stipend we pay. If anybody who's taught as an adjunct knows, it's not about the stipend. So we ended up having to create a training model, because we'd have 20 people come forward and say, I want to get in. How do I teach with your program? And so we had to start a class on the side that started training them. And then that's also where the manuscript came from. And really codifying the entire pedagogy was being able to handle semester cohorts of adjunct instructors who wanted to see if this was for them or not.
It's also, I think, where the emergence part of the model comes in. When we started actually getting our instructors to unlearn that old transactional view of leadership, like week 1 is on ethics and week 2 is on identity. And so it's constantly, they were preparing lesson plans and PowerPoints, and maybe I'll use this TED Talk. It became so like, I have to come up with this curriculum that weighted on them, their responsibility for what they needed to bring. And part of our unlearning was the work is the students to do. And now, we really go back to that model where you are holding a space for things to be catalyzed and to come up and to be connected to. And so we'll provide you with this core curriculum. We'll provide you with lesson plans. We'll provide you with all the things that you spend hours of time doing, so you can focus on how are students engaging? What are the questions that are being asked or not asked? How does this connect to what happened? I mean, the vibrancy of our leadership class during the season of the election, that came into the room.
Sure.
And to be honest with you, there was a time in our program where we would not allow it into the room, right? Because if we allow it into the room, we can't control it. I can't be certain about how this is going to go. And unlearning our instructors of you're needing to be certain is not the role modeling that we want to give our students, because they are going to go into an uncertain world. We have to teach them how to connect, how to engage, how to thrive, how to adapt. And if we don't model that in our own teaching style, how do we expect them to have that skill in a very changing, uncertain world? And that part of it's the most vibrant and the most frightening part of our teaching model is you go in with a plan and it lasts about 15 minutes. The instructors that don't last with us hang on to that plan, and then everyone loses. So I think once we liberated them to saying, you got to run with it, and sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. But I don't know if you've had this experience, Dan, but I've had some horrible, horrible classes that I've walked back to my car going, that just got out. And I found out later it was probably the most productive class I had, because students were now present and they were frustrated and they were trying to make meaning of it. And I realized, oh, it's because I wasn't the reason for that class. They were the reason for that class.
Yeah.
And so being open to that then changed everything for us.
Yeah, it's creating an environment where things can emerge. And as you were speaking, I was thinking it's not just a clever name. It is intentional emergence. You are creating an environment, or a petri dish, if you will, of an environment where things are going to happen, but you have to set up the conditions in order to do that. And so this model of pedagogy, I was thinking, is it meta teaching? Because by providing them, the curriculum and kind of the pieces around, it does provide for an instructor to be more hyper aware of everything else that's going on. And I find, speaking with and doing professional development with other faculty and leadership educators, is, it takes folks a good 8 to 10 years before they're just 100%, I mean, not 100%, but they're more comfortable in the classroom. They don't have to, rush to read the textbook before the class because they've been teaching that class for 6 years or 8 semesters or whatever it is, and so they have that comfort and don't have to worry about the content as much. One of the things that you brought up that I'd hoped to ask that was on my list of the 2 things I want to learn a little bit more about. So you mentioned role modeling, and I'm glad you did. How do you pull that out when you are developing your adjuncts to do this work? How do you present this idea of role modeling from a teacher leader perspective, and what are do you find that your adjuncts are open to that idea? Are they surprised by that idea? And what does that transfer of or development of that skill set look like?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. We have. Oh, sorry, we're getting a little.
You're good.
We use the IDI model, the Intercultural Development Inventory, and it really infuses every aspect of our curriculum, from onboarding instructors to using it with our students throughout the entire program. So one of the first things we talk about is it's not so much where you're at on this continuum, it's where you're pushing yourself to be. So many of us come into teaching prepared to be triggered. So we're going to have that student or this student who kind of asks that question in that one way and is threatening our competency. Mm-hmm. And we try to encourage our instructors to keep that IDI model in mind. And if they were in acceptance, how would they handle a question versus being in minimization, where most of Minnesota in higher education is in early minimization, which is, conflict is about to happen, or, that student that I know triggers me. So I'm going to, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. And we're going to put that aside for another time. So we do it through our course that we work with the instructors on as well, the training process. And we try to do class with our instructors. And so then we first role model for them. And then we also use the IDI with them. And then we have them observe other instructors, and they can of course see the other instructors so easily. You can always watch somebody else doing something well or poorly, and then they can apply it to their own teaching. And then finally they have a co-teaching process where they teach with a seasoned instructor, and we come and observe, and they get lots of feedback on it as well.
Where we begin though is all of us bring in our own defaults about authority, and our own defaults about the role of teaching. And so many of us come from this one-way street version where the teacher holds, the information, the knowledge, and the students are supposed to figure out what it is. And then the teacher will validate, thumbs up or thumbs down. And letting go of that, back to our model, the compassion is a big part of our model. Authenticity is a big part of our model. And so letting go of proving that you belong, proving that you're the front of the room, letting go of that. Because we found, back to your role modeling question, if we weren't willing to say, I don't know where we go next, or who has what we need right now. If we couldn't say that in the classroom, how would we expect our students to try to risk it all if they never saw us as teachers? Right. The old version of leadership of always being right means you never experiment, you never risk. And so we watched our students say, until I'm 100% sure, I'm not going to engage, which is the exact opposite of innovation, right? Exact opposite of leadership. And we kept saying, why don't our students do that? And then we realized, because we're not. And so now it's when they see us going, I'm really not sure where we need to go next. Does somebody have that answer? Suddenly that pedestal, we were so worried about falling off it, we have to redefine that to now we're joining. And if we can join with them, then they can join with us. And more importantly, they can join with each other. This whole idea of fake it till you make it is destructive, especially in the social media world where judgment and expectation, they're surrounded by this. So we've took on this whole practice it until you make it publicly, name the struggle, but we have to start with that first. And oddly enough, your question back to instructors, once we took the pressure off them to be magical and amazing and all-knowing, they're like, oh, shoot, I think I can do this work then.
Yeah, and being authentic. Some research that I'm presenting with a group in Brussels at our conference was we did some interviews of about a dozen, actually I think it was 13 leadership educators around the country. This was early in 2015, and one of the things that came out as a theme was this idea of the role modeling and the fact that and this idea that our experienced leadership educators do feel that that is a huge responsibility, that they are accountable for how they facilitate learning in the classroom, in as much or at a level that what the students see them do and how they manage and facilitate learning is representative of another learning outcome. That, hey, watch how I manage this classroom. Watch how I facilitate this conversation learning. I expect you to do the same when you go back to your organizations, whether it be a student organization or your business or your nonprofit or your church group or your synagogue or whatever. And that's something that is deep in the resolve of many of our leadership educators. And I'm not sure if that's something that comes out over time or that you realize, but the fact that you're teaching that and that's part of the curriculum, I think is key. And so that's an observation. And I'm curious, would you say that is perhaps one of the most challenging skills that you have to teach your folks in this experience, or is there something else that comes to mind when you think about that big challenge or barrier from a pedagogical sense that you want your part-timers going through this experience to master?
Yeah, absolutely. When you say the word leadership instructor or professor in higher education or any of these terms, I think our instructors come into that and feel an incredible amount of pressure to be competent, to be right, to demonstrate that they are true leaders. And so, as David mentioned, it takes a great deal of unlearning first and really challenging them in the same way that we challenge our students, sitting with them, doing one-to-ones with them, observing them and giving them feedback. It's a huge part of it. And a lot of people, not a lot, but I would say a few people at the end of each semester say, this isn't actually for me. I'm a trainer and I'm going to continue to be a trainer because there's a right answer there. And I go in and I get out, and this kind of teaching isn't for me yet.
I think it also gets triggered by moments of stress, right? And so being open to the emergence model means we're trying to get some heat in the room. We're trying to challenge some assumptions. We push back on some things that happen, and so one of our trainings, we go through what happened when it's the third time that one of our students has called one of the two students in the room who's a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf by the wrong name. And we're like, oh, but I'm sorry, it was just a mistake. And that gets challenged by the instructor. Like, what is behind this? Like, what does that represent in the system? Well, the heat of the room just goes way up. And to be in that moment, the only way to manage that moment then is to do so in that challenge and support. Like, I want to support that we're taking on this conversation and this is real. I want to support the fact that as an instructor, me personally, my identity as a white male, I've been in fear of doing that exact same thing, right? And being vulnerable and authentic with that, but then saying as a class, okay, let's not look away from this. What else does this look like? Who do we marginalize? Who do we not include? And why? Not because I don't care for that student, but because I don't feel like I have the ability to connect, that I don't bring enough. So suddenly the whole agenda of the class has been changed by that one moment. And if I can't let go in that high stress moment, I'll be the one as the instructor to turn the heat down, to go right back to the next slide on the PowerPoint, to say, oh, sure, that happens all the time. You didn't take that seriously, right? And make the student who might have been really marginalized have to forgive, right? And double down on the marginalization. Like, those are the moments that we want to make sure our instructors can say, you don't have to have the perfect answer for what happens there. You have to be able to ask the right question. You have to be able to stay in that moment and ask your students to stay in that moment. And if we can get them to do that, then whatever occurs can be of value It's why we love case and point practices, even though we don't use a case and point model. Those techniques, though, inside these emergent moments, I think are so wonderful and so useful. We just have found that for undergraduates, that just having that experience, where are we at? What's the here and now? It has to have some context before and some what happens next. But in that moment, some of these moments can be transformational.
And that container around it too. I would say for emerging adults, all those words that surround the two circles, we consider that the container of the classroom. You know, if you haven't built community, if you don't have authenticity, if you can't balance challenge and support, then don't get into the emergent stuff yet. Because you can't, people can be damaged and hurt, and unless you have that container in place, it's a little too challenging.
I'm sorry.
I'll just say the structure is so important. It seems to be, you know, essential in what you're doing. You're talking about that container. You're not just agitating or using the case and point method aimlessly. You know, there is that curriculum. There's the learning outcomes that have been, you know, decided on in your course or curriculum design, and I think that's one of the strong points of the model. So go ahead, please.
We use metaphor a lot because story is so salient to our students and also ourselves. But we tell our instructors, we don't teach leadership like teaching how to, we don't teach people how to swim by throwing them off the end of the pier and say good luck out there. Nor do we teach leadership that way. We teach leadership by saying we're in the water with you, and we're going to gradually get deeper and deeper, and we are going to let go of your hand because you need to learn how to swim. But even though we let go of your hand, we are still right here. And that the whole idea of leadership as an arena and a battlefield, we just reject that model because it's a one winner, one loser. It's a binary model, and we'd much rather be in the world of who do we need at the table and how do we work together and where do we find multiple wins. And in order to do that, that challenge and support type of atmosphere needs to be present. Otherwise, it's going to be everyone for themselves. And I think we have a lot of evidence that everyone for themselves worlds only serve some, and usually the same some. And I think you'd agree with this. I know ILA agrees with this. We are trying to create models for the more of us and for the multiple wins. And we have to start that in the classroom.
Definitely. So where do you see the future of, I would say, both developing faculty to teach in this way and or using this type of pedagogy in the classroom? You know, what's next as you continue to offer these seminars, both for your faculty and for others, and with the scholarship of propelling this model for the greater good.
We've been kind of obsessed with identity. I think rightfully so. And at this point in our nation's history, we can't ignore how identity plays a role in leadership or how it plays a role in teaching and learning. And so in earlier versions of our model, you may have noticed that the two yellow ribbons that kind of go around it weren't there before. But we've spent so much time on identity work in ourselves with our students that we realized what we choose to notice, what we choose to see is emerging is so linked to our identities and our students' identities. We can't ignore that anymore. And just recently, we've been having conversations with a researcher at the University of Minnesota, Moin Said, who's working on research in the areas of master narrative. It's kind of similar to other work that's been done, but it's this idea of how much resistance do we need to the master narrative and how much buy-in do we need in order to reshape a narrative that works for more people.
We're spending, I think, some more time too getting our students to own their learning. They're still stuck in this is great as long as I'm in my classroom for this 75 minutes, but it doesn't exist after I leave the space. And that setup we found from our alumni that we didn't take it with us, and they did, but they didn't take it with them in a way that they trusted. And so getting them now to do more practice, more work in the field, even earlier now, the instructor takes less and less of the role. We role model the work, we remind them the work needs to be done, and then we give it to them to do. We're always amazed at even how leadership students expect authority to be the authorization. We're good at that. And then, of course, I kept going, why don't our students interrupt and disrupt and take over? And then Linnette and I co-taught a class this year for the first time, and Linnette would be teaching, and I would go, oh, I really think we should go here, but I'm not going to say anything because she's in charge, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, if I can't interrupt and collaborate and in real time with my colleague, because I'm afraid of making a mistake, or I'm afraid of my colleague going, didn't you trust me? And yet I expect my students to do that with me. Again, we've got to change that look of authority. We got to get them practicing more often, or they're not going to go to their new workforce and go, wow, I've learned things that might be helpful here, but I don't suppose you need those, right? So how do we give them that agency? And so spending more and more time turning that work over to them. And what does that look like from a curriculum standpoint? That's, I think, the work of our next couple of years.
Great. Anything else you'd like to add or share from our conversation, or anything else that you've talked about?
I just think whatever people choose to do, whatever works in people's context, it's important that we continue to come back to our own context and ask what model will support the work that we're doing there. I think leadership education as a field is light years ahead of where it was in the 90s when our program started. And so more and more people are moving beyond discrete activities that into a more scaffolded approach. And I'm really excited about that. But it's all about contextualizing for where you're at and what your needs are, but making sure that there's integrity throughout the whole thing.
And don't do the work alone. I mean, I think that's why our associations are so important to us. This 20-minute conversation with you, this was, I'm invigorated. We have to have more, we have to find real places for these conversations though, or else you just get caught up in the work. And then when you get caught up in the work, you usually get caught up in your work. And so how do we expand our perspectives by bringing more people in? How do we find time for these conversations? How do we collaborate? If we don't do that, we just don't expand. And so I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
No, I'm glad to host you, and I'm also invigorated to see some more. And I'll steal your phraseology, the intentional emergence of more professional development programs for faculty to become more skilled at teaching leadership, so that our students can benefit, and certainly our associations are important as a vehicle for sharing that knowledge broadly and widely to those that need those opportunities. So thank you so much for joining us today. So as we close out, Pause for Pedagogy's initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association, and articles and videos are available at www.ila-net.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at @the_ILA. Thank you so much. Thanks, David. And thanks for that.